The late afternoon sun bore down relentlessly as I turned onto my street, my old pickup's engine humming a little louder than usual. I'd finished up my business trip early, a rare blessing, and figured I'd surprise Lila. It had been too long since we'd shared a real moment together. Maybe tonight we'd head to that new bistro she kept hinting about. I pulled into the driveway, and something immediately felt off. The garden lights were already on, glowing against the sunlight. Lila wasn't one to waste electricity. Then I saw it, a sleek black Jaguar half hidden under the oak tree. I knew that car. It belonged to Ian Carrington, her gym's star trainer. I'd caught him looking at her more than once. His smooth, confident smirk grated on me even back at the neighborhood barbecue. Now, seeing his car here while I was supposed to be miles away, that unease in my chest turned to dread. Walking up the gravel path to the front door, I glanced at the house I had built with my own 2 hands. Every beam and panel carried sweat and sacrifice. This place wasn't just my home. It was my monument to everything I had worked for. It was supposed to be our fortress. The door was unlocked. Inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. The first thing that caught my eye was a glass of wine on the coffee table. Merlot, her favorite. The kind she saved for special occasions. My jaw clenched as I noticed a second, empty glass beside it. Taking slow, deliberate steps, I climbed the staircase. Each footfall echoed through the house. Family photos lined the walls, glaring at me like silent witnesses. At the top of the stairs, muffled laughter slipped through the crack of our bedroom door, sending a chill down my spine. My hand gripped the knob. Part of me wanted to storm in, another part wanted to turn around and leave. But there was no going back. Not anymore. I pushed the door open, and there they were. Lila and Ian froze mid-tangle, her hair disheveled, his shirt halfway undone. The bedsheets tangled around them like some guilty shield. The world seemed to pause as Lila's eyes widened in pure, unfiltered panic. Ian's expression, on the other hand, was a mix of shock and cockiness, as if he couldn't believe he'd been caught but wasn't entirely sorry about it. Caleb, Lila stammered, clutching the sheet to her chest like that would somehow make her less exposed. Ian had the audacity to smirk as he swung his legs off the bed. This isn't what it looks like, man. That was it. I snapped. All the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it boiled over in one blinding wave. I didn't answer him. Instead, I crossed the room and swung. My fist connected with his jaw, the impact sending him staggering backward into the dresser. The noise was deafening, the crash of his body against the wood, Lila's panicked screams, my pulse pounding like a drum in my ears. "Caleb! Stop!" she screamed, trying to wedge herself between us. But Ian was back on his feet, trying to act tough. "You wanna go?" he spat, blood already dripping from his split lip. "Oh, we're going," I snarled. He lunged, throwing a sloppy punch that barely grazed my cheek. I grabbed him by the collar and drove him into the wall. The thud shook the house. Years of lifting steel beams and swinging hammers made quick work of him. My fists landed again and again, each blow a release of all the bottled-up rage I didn't even know I had. Lila was yelling something, her voice shrill and frantic, but I didn't stop until Ian's smug smirk was replaced with a bloodied, swollen grimace. When I finally let go, he crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. "You're insane," he choked out, trying to scramble to his feet. "Get out," I growled, stepping over him. He didn't need telling twice. Ian stumbled toward the door, grabbing his shirt on the way out. Lila followed him down the hall, still clutching the sheet around her. I could hear her pleading with him to leave, her voice cracking with desperation. A few minutes later, tires screeched out of the driveway, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I stayed where I was, standing in the wreckage of my bedroom, our bedroom, trying to catch my breath. My hands throbbed, my knuckles scraped raw, but the ache in my chest was worse. "Caleb," Lila's voice came from the doorway, trembling. I turned to face her, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't even look at her. Her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands, the pathetic way she whispered, "I'm sorry." It was like looking at a stranger. "Why?" was all I could manage to say. My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. No explanation, no excuse, just silence. And in that moment, Something inside me broke. This wasn't just betrayal, it was the end of the life I thought we were building together. After Ian's car screeched off, the house felt like a tomb. Lila stood there, wrapped in a sheet, her face blotchy and streaked with tears. I didn't say a word. I just grabbed a clean shirt from the dresser and started to leave. Caleb. Wait. Please, she said, stepping into my path. Her voice was shaky, desperate. I stopped, but I didn't look at her. What's there to talk about, Lila? I messed up, she whispered, her voice breaking. It was a mistake. A mistake? I snapped, finally turning to face her. A mistake is forgetting the anniversary. A mistake is denting the truck. Sleeping with him. That's not a mistake, Lila. That's a choice. Her lip quivered, but I didn't care. Not this time. You let him into my house. Into my bed. My voice was rising now, and I didn't bother to hide it. The bed I built with my own hands. Do you even get how much you've destroyed? I wasn't thinking. No, I interrupted, pointing at her. You were thinking. You were thinking about him. Not me. Not us. Him. She started crying harder, but I was beyond comfort. I grabbed my keys off the nightstand, brushing past her. Where are you going? She asked, her voice cracking. Anywhere but here. Caleb, don't leave. Please. She reached for my arm, but I pulled away. Don't, I said firmly, my tone colder than I'd ever thought possible. I walked out, slamming the front door behind me. Outside, the sun was setting, but the heat hadn't let up. I climbed into the truck, gripping the steering wheel with hands that were still shaking. I didn't know where I was headed. I just drove. Past the fields, past the main strip, past the little diner where Lila and I used to grab late-night coffee. The same one where we talked about dreams we were supposed to build together. The memories hit hard, but I shook them off. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of a dirt road, overlooking a quiet stretch of Texas plain. The truck's engine rumbled beneath me as I leaned back in the seat, staring out at the endless horizon. I'd worked my whole life to build something real, something that would last. I thought I'd done it with her. The silence was broken by the buzz of my phone. Her name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Then came a text. Please come home. We need to talk. I didn't reply. What was there to say? Talking wouldn't undo what I'd just seen. It wouldn't erase the image of Ian's smug face or the sound of her laughter echoing from our room. I stayed out until the stars lit up the sky. When I finally went back, the house was dark except for the dim porch light. Inside, the glass of wine was still on the coffee table. The sheets on the bed were stripped, tossed into a crumpled heap in the corner. Lila was asleep on the couch, her face puffy and pale from crying. I didn't wake her. Instead, I grabbed a spare blanket, laid it over her, and retreated to the guest room. It was the first night I'd ever slept in there. And the first night I felt like a stranger in my own home. But sleep didn't come. Only questions. How long had this been going on? How many times? How blind had I been? Morning came too quickly, and with it, the hard reality that things would never be the same. I woke up in the guest room with a stiff neck and a pounding headache. The sun streamed through the blinds, too bright and too early. I didn't even remember falling asleep. I just lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling, trying to gather the strength to face whatever was waiting downstairs. When I finally got up, the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. I found Lila at the kitchen table, still wearing the clothes from the night before. Her coffee sat untouched in front of her, her eyes red and swollen. She looked up as I entered, but I didn't say anything. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, keeping my distance. Caleb, she started softly, her voice rough, I know there's nothing I can say to make this right, but I need you to know. Stop, I cut her off, setting the mug down harder than I meant to. I don't want your excuses, Lila. I want the truth. How long has this been going on? Her hands trembled as she gripped the mug. A few months, she admitted, her voice barely audible. A few months? I repeated, my stomach turning. You've been sneaking around behind my back for months? She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Why? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Was I not enough? Was the house I built, the life I gave you, not enough? It's not that, she said quickly, shaking her head. It was never about you, Caleb. It was me. I felt lost, invisible. You were always so busy with work, and I needed someone to notice me. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. So you found Ian? The guy who winks at every woman he sees? That's who you needed? She flinched but didn't deny it. I know I've hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. But I never stopped loving you. It was a mistake. I don't even know why I let it happen. I stared at her, trying to process her words. You never stopped loving me? I repeated, incredulous. You don't cheat on someone you love, Lila. You don't bring another man into your home, into your bed, if you love them. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But the anger, the betrayal, the humiliation, it was too much. Do you love him? I asked, my voice cold. Her head shot up, panic flashing in her eyes. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't love. It was nothing. Nothing, I echoed bitterly. Funny, it didn't look like nothing when I walked in. Her silence said everything I needed to know. I grabbed my truck keys from the counter, the urge to get out of that house stronger than ever. Where are you going? She asked, her voice trembling. Out, I said flatly. And don't follow me. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the quiet morning air. As I drove aimlessly down the back roads, the weight of it all pressed down on me. Her affair wasn't just a betrayal of our vows. It was a betrayal of the life I thought we were building. I wasn't just angry at her. I was angry at myself. How had I not seen this coming? How had I been so blind to what was happening right in front of me? For the first time, I realized I might not be able to fix this. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to. By the time I pulled back into the driveway, it was mid-afternoon. The house looked the same as it always did, but something about it felt smaller. Like the walls were closing in on me, and every memory it held was tainted. Lila was still at the kitchen table when I walked in, her coffee untouched, now cold. She didn't look up this time, just stared at the swirling grain of the wood like it might hold the answer to her mess. I want answers, I said, my voice low but firm. All of them. And I don't want some sugar-coated excuse. You owe me that much. She flinched but nodded. Ask me anything. I dropped my keys on the counter, the clang making her jump. How long? She took a shaky breath. 4 months. My chest tightened. 4 months. While I'd been working late nights and putting in double shifts to give us everything, she'd been entertaining him. Where? I asked, dreading the answer. Sometimes at the gym, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes. Here. The rage bubbled up again, and I gripped the counter to steady myself. In our house? I spat. While I was out working, you brought him here? She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. How many times? Her face crumpled, and she shook her head. I don't know, she whispered. You don't know? I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. You can't even keep track of how many times you betrayed me? I'm sorry, Caleb, she sobbed. I didn't mean for it to happen. That's a lie, I said sharply, taking a step closer. You don't just accidentally fall into this kind of betrayal. You made a choice. Lila. Every single time, you chose him. Her sobs turned into hiccups, and she buried her face in her hands. I felt no sympathy. Why him? I asked after a long pause, my voice quieter but no less cold. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy. I don't know. He made me feel wanted. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Wanted, I repeated. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to give you a good life? A house? Security? All for what? So you could find some guy to make you feel wanted? It wasn't about that, she protested, her voice trembling. Then what was it about? I challenged, staring her down. She opened her mouth to answer but couldn't, and that silence told me more than her words ever could. I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back. The guest room felt like a refuge compared to the rest of the house, even though it wasn't mine. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of everything. How had we gotten here? When had the cracks started to show? Was it when I started taking on extra jobs? Was it the long hours, the missed date nights, the silence that crept into our conversations? Or was it just her? The realization hit me hard. It didn't matter how much I worked or how many sacrifices I made. This wasn't about me falling short. This was about her looking for something else, someone else, and betraying everything we'd built in the process. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. A text from my brother Daniel. "Hey, heard you're back early. Everything okay?" I stared at the screen, debating whether to tell him. Daniel had always been the level-headed one, the guy who could find calm in chaos. But this wasn't just chaos, it was my life, ripped apart. I typed out a reply but erased it. Not yet. Not until I figured out what I wanted to do. And that's when it hit me. I couldn't stay in this house with her, not without losing what little sanity I had left. Tomorrow, I'd call a lawyer. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a freight train. The emotional exhaustion clung to me like a weight, but I forced myself out of bed. If I was going to get through this, I couldn't just sit around drowning in my anger. I grabbed my phone and called Daniel. He picked up after a few rings. "Hey, Caleb. What's up?" His voice was calm, like always, a sharp contrast to the storm in my chest. "I need to talk," I said simply. "Talk or vent?" he asked, already sensing the tone. "Both." "Come over," he said without hesitation. "Coffee's on." I didn't tell Lila where I was going. I doubted she'd ask, and honestly, I didn't care. She'd hold herself up in our room after last night's conversation, and the silence between us was more deafening than any argument. When I got to Daniel's house, he was waiting on the porch, 2 steaming mugs in hand. He gave me a once-over, his brows furrowing. "You look like hell," he said, handing me a mug. "Feel worse," I muttered. We sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee and watching the neighborhood wake up. I could feel him waiting, giving me space to start when I was ready. "Lila cheated," I finally said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Daniel froze mid-sip. "What?" I stared at the steam rising from my mug. "She's been sleeping with some guy from her gym. Ian Carrington." He set his coffee down, his jaw tightening. "How long?" "4 months. In our house," I said, my voice cold. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Damn. Caleb. I don't even know what to say." "I'm sorry, man." "I don't need sorry," I said, shaking my head. "I need to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do now." "Well, are you staying?" he asked bluntly. The question hit harder than I expected. "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me wants to walk away and never look back. But then there's this other part that keeps asking if I should try to fix it. If it's even fixable. Daniel didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes focused on the horizon. "You can't fix something if you're the only one trying," he finally said. "It's not just about her saying she's sorry. She has to show it. And you have to ask yourself if you can ever trust her again." Trust. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. "I don't know if I can," I said quietly. He nodded. "Then maybe that's your answer." I sat there, letting his words sink in. He was right. No matter how much I wanted to turn back the clock, things would never be the same. Lila could apologize 100 times, but the damage was done. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You start thinking about yourself for once. Call a lawyer. Figure out your options. Take some time away if you need to, but don't make any decisions out of anger. Give yourself space to breathe first." I nodded, feeling a glimmer of clarity for the first time in days. "Thanks, man." "Anytime," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. I stayed for another hour, talking about everything but Lila. It felt good to focus on something else, even for a little while. When I finally left, I felt a little stronger. Not whole but enough to take the next step. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had a plan. Call a lawyer, gather the facts, and take it one day at a time. Inside, the house was quiet. Lila was in the kitchen, her back to me as she stirred something on the stove. She didn't turn around when I entered, but I could tell she knew I was there. "We need to talk," I said firmly. She froze for a moment before turning to face me. Her eyes were puffy, her face pale. "Okay," she whispered. "Not now," I added quickly. "I need to make some calls first." "But soon." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the spoon. I didn't wait for her response. I headed to the guest room, closed the door, and dialed the number of the best family lawyer I could find. This wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about taking back control of my life. And for the first time in days, I felt like I could. The lawyer's office was an unassuming brick building tucked away downtown. I parked the truck in a narrow lot and sat there for a moment, staring at the faded family law specialist's sign above the door. It felt surreal, walking into this building, knowing I was here to potentially unravel my life piece by piece. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile, her voice soft and professional. "Mr. Steele? Mr. Hampton will see you now." I followed her down a quiet hallway into a modest office. The room smelled faintly of leather and coffee. A tall, lean man with gray at his temples rose from behind his desk, extending a hand. "Caleb Steele," he said with a nod. "I've heard good things about your construction work." "Thanks," I muttered, shaking his hand. "Though I didn't come here for a job." He gestured for me to sit, adjusting his glasses as he settled into his chair. "Of course. Let's get into it. Tell me what's going on." For the next 20 minutes, I laid it all out. The affair, the house, the betrayal that felt bigger than words. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, jotting down notes in a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in thought. "First off, Caleb, I'm sorry you're going through this. No one should have to. Now, let's talk about where things stand." He explained the basics, the division of assets, Texas laws regarding fault in a divorce, and the impact of infidelity on settlements. My stomach churned as he detailed how things like shared accounts and property could be handled. "Given the circumstances," he said, "you might have a strong case for protecting your financial interests. That's assuming you want to go the divorce route." I nodded slowly. "And if I'm not ready to decide yet?" "That's fair," he said, setting the pen down. "Sometimes people need space to process before making a move. You can file a separation agreement first, which sets boundaries and protects your assets while you figure out what's next." The thought of dragging this out weighed on me, but he was right. Jumping into a decision while I was still raw wasn't smart. "What about the house?" I asked. "I built it from the ground up. I've poured everything I've got into it." "Understandable," he said. "If you divorce, it may still be considered community property unless you have a prenup or other documentation. However, we could argue that the sweat equity you've invested gives you greater claim." "That's something we'll fight for." The word fight struck a chord in me. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war to protect what I'd built. When I left the office, I had a folder of documents tucked under my arm and a heavy weight in my chest. The lawyer had been calm, professional, and honest. But there was no sugarcoating the reality. Divorce would be messy. Driving home, I passed the diner where Lila and I used to go for breakfast on lazy Sundays. I'd always loved watching her sip her coffee, laughing at my terrible jokes. For a moment, I let myself feel the sting of what was gone, what she had taken from me. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the house in soft golden light. The sight of it, our dream home, stirred a strange mix of pride and bitterness. Lila was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm evening air. She looked up as I approached, her eyes red and tired. "You were gone all day," she said softly. "I had things to take care of," I replied, brushing past her to unlock the front door. "Caleb, can we please talk?" she called after me. Her voice sounded small, almost fragile, but I wasn't ready. "Not yet." "Not tonight," I said over my shoulder, stepping inside. I went straight to the guest room and shut the door, leaning against it for a moment before tossing the lawyer's folder onto the bed. My head throbbed, my body heavy with exhaustion. For the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my own home. That evening, hours later, I found myself sitting in the dark, a glass of bourbon in hand. The house was silent, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a weight. I thought about everything the lawyer had said, the road ahead, and what it would cost me to start over. Lila's footsteps creaked softly in the hallway. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. "Caleb," she called, her voice hesitant. "What?" I said flatly. "I made dinner." I thought, maybe we could sit down and talk. Just talk. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to shut her out completely. But another part, the part that still held onto a shred of the life we'd shared, wanted to hear what she had to say. "Fine," I said eventually, setting the glass down. When I entered the kitchen, the table was set, 2 plates of spaghetti sitting across from each other. Lila stood at the counter, fidgeting with her hands. "I know you're angry," she began as I sat down. "Angry doesn't cover it," I said, not bothering to soften my tone. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I deserve that. I deserve worse." "But Caleb, Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't try to justify it. Just be honest." For the next hour, she talked. About how she felt neglected, how Ian had been a distraction, a way to escape. She admitted she'd been selfish, that she hadn't considered the consequences. I listened, my jaw tight, my hands clenched into fists under the table. When she finally finished, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the untouched plate in front of me. "Do you even want to fix this?" I asked, my voice low. "Yes," she said without hesitation, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes, Caleb. I'll go to counseling. I'll move out if you want space. That's not what I asked," I said sharply. "I asked if you want to fix this. Not because you're scared of losing the house or being alone, but because you care about me, about us." Her silence was deafening. "Thought so," I muttered, pushing my chair back and standing. Lila reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I need time, Lila. And you need to figure out if you're fighting for me or for your pride." With that, I left her sitting at the table, her sobs echoing softly as I closed the door to the guest room behind me. The days after that dinner stretched out like a slow-moving storm. Lila tried in her own way to reach out, leaving small notes on the counter, offering to talk, or making meals I didn't touch. It felt more like damage control than genuine effort, and every gesture felt hollow. I wasn't sure if she was trying to save me, our marriage, or just herself. For my part, I kept my distance. I threw myself into work, taking on projects that pushed me to exhaustion. Anything to keep my mind too busy to dwell on the images, the sounds, the feelings that haunted me every time I closed my eyes. But the thing about betrayal is that it follows you everywhere. At night, I slept in the guest room, though sleep might have been generous. Most nights, I just stared at the ceiling, running through every conversation, every moment that might have been a warning sign. What had I missed? Had I worked too much? Been too distant? Could I have prevented this? One evening, I came home later than usual, covered in dirt and sweat from a job site. The porch light was on, but the house was dark inside. I almost sighed with relief, assuming Lila had gone to bed early. But when I stepped inside, I found her sitting in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded in her direction but didn't stop moving. "I'm beat. I'm heading to bed." "Caleb, wait." Her voice stopped me mid-step. I turned to face her, exhaustion tugging at every part of me. "What, Lila?" She hesitated, twisting the corner of the blanket in her hands. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I've started looking for a therapist. Someone we can talk to. Together or separately, if that's what you want." I stared at her, the words washing over me but not sinking in. Therapy. Was that her big fix? A few sessions with a stranger who didn't know us, didn't know what she'd done? "That's great," I said flatly, turning back toward the hallway. "Caleb, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying here. I know I screwed up. I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I still love you. And I'm not ready to give up on us." I stopped, my back still to her. For a second, I almost turned around, almost said something to ease the tension hanging between us like a noose. But then I thought of Ian, his smirk, his arrogance, the way he walked out of my house like he owned it. And I thought of her, laughing with him in the bedroom we once shared. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice colder than I intended. Her sobs followed me down the hall, but I didn't turn back. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain, a rare thing in our part of Texas. It came down in sheets, drumming against the roof and windows like it was trying to wash everything away. Lila wasn't in the kitchen when I came out, which was unusual. She was always up before me, at least in the last few days, trying to catch me before I left for work. For a brief moment, I wondered if she'd finally given up. But then I saw her car keys on the counter, sitting next to a handwritten note. "Caleb, I've gone to stay with my sister for a few days. I think we both need some space, and I don't want to keep crowding you when it's clear you're not ready to talk. Please know that I'm doing everything I can to make this right. I love you, Lila." I stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring together. The house felt emptier without her, but not in a way that felt wrong. If anything, the quiet was a relief. I folded the note and slid it into my back pocket, then grabbed my keys and headed out. At work, the site was a mess of mud and chaos when I got there. The rain had turned the dirt into a swamp, and a delivery truck had gotten stuck in the driveway. My foreman, a wiry guy named Pete, waved me over the second I stepped out of the truck. "Morning, boss," he called, shouting over the rain. "Hope you've got some good news, 'cause this mess ain't gonna clean itself." I smiled grimly, shaking my head. "Not today, Pete. Let's get to it." The work was hard and relentless, but that was exactly what I needed. There was no room for thinking, no space for anything but the next task. By the time the rain let up, I was soaked to the bone, my muscles aching in the best way. Pete pulled me aside as we wrapped up for the day, handing me a thermos of coffee. "You all right, Caleb? You've been off lately." I took the coffee, nodding slowly. "Just a lot on my plate, Pete. I'll be fine." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Well, if you need an ear, you know where to find me." I appreciated the gesture, even if I wasn't ready to take him up on it. That night, the house was quiet when I got home, almost eerily so. I set my boots by the door and stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle over me. For the first time in days, I let myself feel it all. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it all came rushing in like a flood. I sat on the couch, my head in my hands, and let the tears come. It wasn't about weakness. It was about release. About letting myself feel what I'd been trying so hard to push down. When the tears finally stopped, I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep living like this. It was time to take the next step, whatever that might be. The days without Lila in the house were strange, like living in a hollowed-out version of my life. The quiet felt different, less suffocating but still heavy, like a weight I couldn't put down. I didn't call her, and she didn't call me. Her absence gave me space to breathe, but it also left me with nothing to distract myself from the questions gnawing at my mind. I worked long hours, coming home only to shower and collapse in the guest room. Every day blurred into the next until, finally, Daniel texted me, "Come over for dinner. You can't keep avoiding people forever." I almost ignored him, but something in his message stuck. Avoiding people? Maybe he was right. I'd buried myself so deep in work that I hadn't spoken to anyone outside of the job site in days. I needed to get out of my head, even if it was just for a few hours. That evening, I drove to Daniel's place. The smell of grilled chicken greeted me as I walked through the door. His wife, Megan, gave me a warm smile and a quick hug. "It's good to see you," she said, her tone gentle. "You've been missed." I managed a small smile. "Thanks, Megan." We sat around the table, the easy chatter between them a reminder of what I once had. Daniel didn't push me to talk, but after dinner, when Megan stepped into the kitchen to clean up, he leaned back in his chair and studied me. "You look a little better," he said. "Still rough, but better." "Thanks for the pep talk," I said, my tone dry. He chuckled. "Seriously, though, how are you holding up?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know, man. Some days I'm angry as hell. Other days, I just feel numb. I keep thinking about what the lawyer said, about next steps, but the thought of tearing everything apart makes me sick. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. You don't have to decide everything right now, but you need to ask yourself what you want. Not what's easiest, not what other people think you should do, what you want. I don't even know anymore, I admitted. Then start small, he said. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about your future? I hesitated, the answer forming in my head before I could stop it. Peace, I said quietly. He nodded again, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then chase that. Whatever it looks like for you, go after it. Later that night, I drove home under a sky full of stars, Daniel's words echoing in my mind. What did peace look like for me? Was it fixing things with Lila? Letting go of the anger and trying to rebuild? Or was it starting over, walking away from everything we'd built together? When I got home, the house was as quiet as ever. I stepped inside, set my keys on the counter, and paused. There, in the middle of the kitchen table, was something I hadn't noticed before. A small box, tied with a ribbon. I frowned, walking over and picking it up. Attached was a note in Lila's handwriting. Caleb. I found this while I was packing up a few things at my sister's house. It reminded me of who we used to be, and I thought you might want it. I'm still here, Caleb, waiting for you to decide if you want me to be. Lila. I opened the box carefully, my chest tightening as I pulled out its contents. An old photo of us, taken years ago at a lake near Austin. We were younger then, laughing, arms wrapped around each other like nothing in the world could touch us. Beneath the photo was a small keychain, one I'd given her on our first anniversary. It was cheap, a little wooden heart I'd carved myself because money was tight back then. She'd carried it on her keys for years. I stared at the photo, my thumb brushing over the worn edges. For the first time in weeks, I felt a crack in the armor I'd built around myself. The next morning, I woke up with the photo still on the nightstand, Lila's note tucked underneath. The memory of that day by the lake lingered, pulling at something deep inside me. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the sunlight streaming through the blinds, I realized something. I couldn't stay in limbo forever. I had to make a choice, not just for me, but for both of us. I grabbed my phone and scrolled to Lila's name. My thumb hovered over the call button before I finally pressed it. She picked up on the second ring. Caleb. We need to talk, I said. Her voice trembled. Okay. When? Tonight, I replied. At the house. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then she whispered, I'll be there. After hanging up, I sat there, the weight of what I'd just done settling over me. Tonight, I'd find out if there was anything left to salvage, or if it was time to finally let go. The hours leading up to Lila's arrival dragged on like slow-moving shadows. I cleaned the house, not because I cared about appearances but because I needed to stay busy. When that wasn't enough, I paced the living room, checking the time every few minutes. At 7 p.m. sharp, I heard the rumble of her car in the driveway. A moment later, the front door creaked open, and there she was, standing in the entryway with a cautious expression, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. Thanks for coming, I said, my voice even. She nodded, clutching the strap of her purse. Thank you for giving me the chance. I gestured for her to sit, and we settled into opposite chairs at the dining table, the same spot where she'd made spaghetti a week ago. The weight of everything unsaid hung between us like a storm cloud. I've been thinking a lot, I started, leaning forward, my hands clasped. About us. About what happened. And about what comes next. She nodded, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I understand, she said softly. No, I don't think you do, I said, meeting her eyes for the first time. Lila, what you did, it broke something in me. In us. And I don't know if it can ever be fixed. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't interrupt. I gave you everything I had, I continued, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. I worked day and night to build this life for us, to give us a future. And you, I stopped, taking a deep breath. You threw it all away for him. For what? A few months of attention? A thrill? She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. Let me finish. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I'm not saying I'm perfect, I said. I know I've made mistakes. Maybe I wasn't around enough. Maybe I didn't show you how much I appreciated you. But what you did wasn't a reaction to my flaws. It was a choice you made. Over and over again. The room was silent except for the sound of her soft crying. I leaned back, letting out a long sigh. I saw the photo you left. The keychain. And yeah, it reminded me of better times. But it also made me realize something. She looked up at me, her expression hopeful and desperate. I deserve better, I said simply. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands, sobbing. Caleb, please, she choked out. I'll do anything to fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll move out if that's what you need. Just don't give up on us. I'm not giving up, I said, my tone firm but not unkind. I'm choosing myself this time. You made your choice, Lila, and now I'm making mine. Her sobs grew louder, but I stayed where I was, my resolve steady. I'll work with you to figure out the logistics, I continued. We'll split things as cleanly as we can. But this marriage, it's over. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. You don't mean that, she whispered. You can't. I do, I said, standing up. I've thought about this for weeks. I've tried to find a way to see past it, to rebuild. But I can't. The trust is gone. And without trust, there's nothing left. She didn't argue this time. Instead, she slumped in her chair, defeated. I'm sorry, Lila, I said, and I meant it. She nodded, her shoulders shaking as she cried. After a long silence, she stood, grabbing her purse. I'll go, she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't stop her. I walked her to the door, watching as she stepped out into the night. She turned back once, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the porch light. I'll always love you, she said. I didn't respond. I just nodded, watching as she got into her car and drove away. Moving forward. When the taillights disappeared, I stepped back inside and locked the door. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not suffocating, just quiet. I sat on the couch, staring at the photo she'd left me. We'd been so happy that day, so full of hope and promise. It hurt to think about what we'd lost, but for the first time, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like a beginning. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Let's move forward, I said. And just like that, the first brick in my new foundation was laid.